The summer of 1680 wrapped Madrid in a suffocating heat. Inside the sprawling halls of the Alcazar, the royal residence, the air felt like it stood still, thick with the heavy scent of lavender, rosewater, and something far less pleasant. It wasn't just the heat that caused courtiers to subtly cover their noses or step aside as the young princess passed. Whispers trailed in her wake. "Her Royal Highness is coming down the corridor," one lady-in-waiting would murmur to another. They'd quickly spritz the air with floral water, but the effect was almost useless. At just 19, Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and niece to her own mother, Mariana of Austria, carried with her an odor so strong and offensive it overpowered the finest perfumes in the court. It was said to resemble rotting fish and damp mildew, and no matter how many times she bathed or what concoctions the perfumers devised, the stench always returned. The condition was a cruel symptom, one of many, of the centuries-old practice that had plagued her bloodline. Generations of marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins, and other close relatives. A desperate attempt by the House of Habsburg to preserve power and property, no matter the cost. From across the room, Don Diego Velázquez de Silva, the court painter, watched her glide past. His eyes, aged and wise, had seen the transformation of this family over decades, had painted them in all their ceremonial grandeur and genetic decline. Each generation wore the Habsburg legacy more clearly in their bones. Jutting jaws, thick lips, hooked noses, and now, unexplainable bodily odors that even the best physicians couldn't treat. Velázquez had once overheard the royal doctor, Luis Mercado, refer to this condition as the price of blood purity. The phrase echoed in his memory. Back in 1605, Mercado had penned a treatise, Morbus Hereditaris, warning of the dangers of inbreeding, but his cautions had gone unheard. The Spanish crown, determined to keep its legacy uncontaminated, continued marrying within the family. In the palace kitchens, a woman named Maria stirred a thick herbal brew in a steaming pot. She was one of the older cooks and had served 3 generations of Habsburgs. Now she crushed rosemary and thyme into a thick paste, part of the latest remedy for the princess's smell. "Poor girl," she muttered. "It's not her fault she was born like this." The door slammed open. The high steward barged in, sweat trickling down his temples. "Hurry with that remedy. Her Highness is about to receive the French ambassador." That ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis of Torcy, was well known for his sharp eye and even sharper reports. King Louis XIV of France was already receiving regular dispatches from him, detailing the physical decline of Spain's royal family. Every observation, every defect, became a weapon at the negotiating table. "I doubt any herb will cover that smell," a young page whispered foolishly. He earned himself a hard slap across the face. "Watch your mouth," barked the steward. "You speak of the royal blood of Spain." In her chambers, Margarita Teresa stood silently as her ladies dressed her for the formal audience. Tears blurred her vision, but she made no sound. They applied thick layers of powder, painted her lips, and draped dazzling jewels around her pale neck. Yet none of it could hide the truth. The mirrors, unyielding and cruel, reflected back the Habsburg jaw, the sunken eyes, the translucent skin tinged with an ill hue. "Your Highness, the ambassador awaits," announced the chamberlain from the door, careful not to inhale too deeply. Margarita Teresa took a breath, steadying herself as she had been taught since she was a child. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and summoned the pride of a Habsburg. "Let him in," she ordered, her voice firmer than she felt. In another wing of the palace, her younger brother Carlos, just 12 years old and already crowned heir to the Spanish throne, sat hunched over a book. His tutor, trying to teach him to read, was slowly losing hope. Carlos's oversized tongue made speech difficult. His malformed jaw garbled even the simplest words. His legs, bent from rickets, made walking painful. He suffered frequent seizures. Intellectually, he lagged far behind other boys his age. "Your Majesty, let's try once more," the tutor urged, fighting back frustration. Carlos blinked slowly, staring at the page, but his eyes drifted again, out the tall window, toward the palace gardens. He could see children playing, running freely, sons of noblemen, strong, fast, healthy. He had never joined them, never could. His fragile body and feeble health confined him to these ornate chambers, protected from even the smallest threat. A common cold, for him, could be fatal. Meanwhile, in the council room, King Philip IV, now aged and tired, sat with his ministers. War with France had drained Spain's coffers. Their colonies in the New World were restless. The economy teetered. But none of these troubles plagued the king's mind as much as the future of his bloodline. "Your Majesty must consider a marriage for Prince Carlos," suggested the Duke of Medinaceli, the Prime Minister. "He's young, yes, but securing the succession must be a priority." Philip IV stroked his gray beard. In his heart, he knew the truth. His son might never be capable of fathering a child. The court physicians had spoken to him in private. Carlos likely suffered from hypogonadism, his fertility compromised, perhaps beyond repair. But what princess in Europe would agree to marry him, given his condition? Still, he said nothing of his doubts. Instead, he nodded solemnly. "Consider the royal houses of France, Austria, and Portugal," he ordered. "Bring appropriate candidates before the council." What he didn't say, what none of them said aloud, was the real reason behind the urgency: the dynasty's obsession with blood purity. It had always been about preserving the line at any cost, and that cost had grown higher with each generation. As the council murmured and scribes took notes, a messenger burst into the chamber. He bowed deeply before the king and handed him a sealed letter. Philip broke the wax with trembling fingers. As he read, his already pale face turned ghostly. "There's been an incident," he said, voice cracking. The audience with the French ambassador was interrupted. The Princess Margarita Teresa fainted in the middle of the reception. Gasps echoed through the room. It wasn't the first time she'd collapsed. Everyone present understood the unspoken truth. Her health was just as fragile as her brother's. "Adjourn the meeting," the king muttered, rising slowly from his seat. "I must see my daughter." As Philip made his way through the palace halls toward Margarita's quarters, a heavy weight settled on his shoulders. He had once proudly married his niece, Mariana of Austria, after the death of his first wife, continuing the centuries-old tradition. He had believed it wise, politically expedient. He had never truly considered what it might mean for his children. Now, as he watched them suffer, their bodies twisted, their minds dim, their futures slipping away, the guilt bore down on him like a crown of iron. He hadn't just doomed his children. He might have doomed the future of the entire Spanish Empire. Deep in the royal library, a single candle flickered beside a hunched figure. The royal physician, brow furrowed, pored over ancient manuscripts, flipping pages with trembling hands. He was searching for something, anything, that might explain the slow unraveling of Spain's most powerful dynasty. His eyes paused on a line from Luis Mercado's old treatise. The repeated union of blood too close in kin produces fragile offspring, prone to illness and disfigurement, and in the worst cases, incapable of reproduction. The doctor exhaled, closing the book softly. There were no cures in these pages, only warnings. Warnings that had been ignored for generations. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Madrid. Thunder rumbled in the distance, as if echoing the turmoil brewing within the Alcazar's gilded walls. The scent of damp stone and wilted lavender filled the corridors, a lingering reminder of Princess Margarita Teresa's condition. That scent had become a symbol now, a signal, not just of decay, but of a bloodline slowly collapsing under the weight of its own legacy. And time was running out. The clock in the tower of the Alcazar struck noon on a cool November day in 1679. Church bells joined in, ringing solemnly as the Spanish royal family made their way into the Cathedral of San Isidro. This was no ordinary service. It was the wedding of Carlos II, now 18 years old and King of Spain since the age of 4, to Maria Luisa of Orléans, the spirited 17-year-old niece of King Louis XIV of France. She had arrived in Madrid just a week earlier. But according to court whispers, the young bride had wept bitterly after laying eyes on her future husband for the first time. And who could blame her? Despite the best efforts of his attendants, powdering, perfuming, dressing, Carlos presented a pitiful figure. Emaciated, weak, with the unmistakable Habsburg jaw so overgrown that he couldn't fully close his mouth. He had to be supported by 2 aides just to stand upright through the ceremony. Cardinal Portocarrero presided over the ritual, his voice trembling as he tried to maintain dignity in the face of the king's struggles. When it came time for Carlos to speak his vows, the church fell into an awkward silence. The king stammered, his tongue too large for his mouth, his words a soft, high-pitched mumble. The congregation held its breath, torn between sympathy and discomfort. In one of the pews, seated near the front, Doña Elvira de Montoya, a respected noblewoman in her 70s, leaned toward her granddaughter. "Look at his hands," she whispered. The girl glanced discreetly. The king's fingers quivered as he held the wedding ring, barely able to guide it onto his bride's hand. "Do you think he can have children?" the young woman whispered back. Doña Elvira scowled at the boldness of the question. But in truth, it was the same thought on everyone's mind. The entire future of the Spanish crown now rested on this fragile boy's ability to sire an heir. And the odds did not look good. At the very front of the church, Queen Mother Mariana of Austria watched with a carefully composed face. She had been the real power behind the throne during Carlos's long minority, and she intended to remain so. Mariana herself was both a product and a proponent of the Habsburgs' inbred tradition. Daughter of the Emperor of Austria, sister to King Philip IV, wife to her own uncle. She had lived the logic of dynastic politics and had reaped its cost. Now she stared at her new daughter-in-law, Maria Luisa, with a blend of suspicion and disapproval. A French princess, brought from across the Pyrenees, a symbol of Bourbon ambition, a threat. In the back of the cathedral, the imperial ambassador, Count Heir, took mental notes for his next report to Vienna. The Austrian Habsburgs, still the senior branch of the family, watched Spain's decline with growing alarm. "The king can hardly remain on his feet," he would later write in his dispatch. "His weakness is such that it's doubtful he'll ever consummate the marriage, let alone produce an heir." After the ceremony, the royal procession returned to the Alcazar for the wedding feast. Carlos II, exhausted from the morning's ordeal, had to excuse himself and rest in his chambers before the celebrations could begin. His doctors administered yet another tonic, a bitter brew of herbs, minerals, and animal extracts. Just one of dozens of remedies they'd tried over the years to strengthen the king's failing body. His Majesty must conserve his energy, one physician murmured to another, casting a glance toward the king's bed. They all knew what came next. Tonight, the marriage was to be consummated. Or at least, that was the plan. In the palace's great hall, the feast carried on with full splendor. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and silver platters. Foreign envoys, nobles, and clergy toasted the union with forced smiles. But many noticed that the king barely touched his food. His jaw, malformed and painful, made chewing difficult. He mostly sipped broths and soft purees. From his place at the head table, the Duke of Medinaceli, the king's closest advisor, watched silently. His expression was troubled. "Look how the foreign dignitaries stare at him," he muttered to the constable of Castile beside him. "Like vultures, circling a dying beast." The constable nodded grimly. Everyone knew the European powers were already positioning themselves for what would come next. The inevitable death of a king without an heir. A divided empire. A war for succession. Louis XIV of France had been laying the groundwork for years. Alliances, backroom deals, diplomatic maneuvers, all in anticipation of this moment. The conversation ended as musicians entered and struck up a soft melody. Courtiers began to dance. Carlos sat stiffly beside his new wife, Maria Luisa, who, despite her tears, had composed herself. She smiled politely, whispered kind words to her husband, played her part. Nearby, a stooped old man watched the scene through keen eyes. Don Francisco de Quevedo y Villegas, the famed satirist and poet, long past his prime but still sharp, leaned toward a younger companion. "Look into the king's eyes," he murmured. "Do you see it?" The young man looked, then nodded slowly. "There's sadness there," he whispered. "A kind of emptiness." "It's the weight of a dying bloodline," Quevedo said. "No crown can protect him from that." "Do you think he knows?" asked the boy. "Enough to feel the burden," replied the poet. "But not enough to grasp the irony that the very policy that made his house great is the same that will destroy it." Elsewhere in the hall, whispers spread like wildfire. In a corner, Maria de Cardenas, one of the queen's maids, leaned toward her mother, an older noblewoman who had served in court for decades. "The queen's worried about tonight," she murmured. "She's heard things about the king's body." Her mother gave a stern look and whispered sharply, "Not here." But yes, the rumors are true. The talk behind closed doors painted a grim picture. Some said Carlos suffered from hypogonadism. Others claimed more severe abnormalities, malformed genitals, possible infertility. The result of a bloodline wound so tightly upon itself, it had begun to unravel at its core. And still, the rituals continued. As midnight approached, the royal couple was guided, ceremonially, toward their nuptial chambers. This was no private affair. The act of consummation, while not directly witnessed, was heavily choreographed, monitored by tradition, and charged with expectation. It was the single most critical act of the king's life, and everyone knew it. Carlos II, looking frail and dazed, was helped by his gentlemen-in-waiting. They undressed him gently, applied perfumes, and handed him another potion, this one laced with exotic spices and rumored aphrodisiacs. The king sipped it without protest. Maria Luisa, on her side, was prepared by her ladies. Her dress was removed, her hair combed and perfumed, and she was offered quiet words of comfort, along with subtle instructions on how to handle the encounter. "Remember, Your Majesty," whispered the Duchess of Terranova, her chief lady-in-waiting, "Spain's future rests on tonight." The young queen gave a nervous nod. As a princess of France, she had been raised to understand the duties of royal marriage. But nothing had prepared her for this night, nor for the man who now bore the title of king. In a nearby chapel, monks prayed fervently. Among them was Father Mateo de Moya, the king's confessor. He knew Carlos's spiritual torment all too well. The shame, the fear, the gnawing belief that he might fail not only as a man, but as a monarch. "Grant our king strength, O Lord," the priest whispered, "and the courage to fulfill his sacred duty." But even he, deep down, wondered, was it truly God's will that this dynasty continue? Or was the slow decay of Carlos's body a divine message in itself? In his private study, Dr. Juan Bautista Juanini, the royal physician, scribbled notes by candlelight. A follower of new medical thinking from France and Italy, Juanini had tried to introduce modern remedies at court. But he faced fierce resistance from traditionalists who still believed sickness came from imbalanced humors or demonic possession. "The king's ailment is neither spiritual nor humoral," Juanini wrote in his journal. "It is structural. It is the result of repeated kin marriages, concentrating defects instead of dispersing them." His theories were far ahead of his time, centuries too early to be understood, but they were accurate. Future generations would confirm his suspicions through the lens of genetic science. The morning after the wedding, the court buzzed with hushed curiosity. No official inspection of the nuptial sheets was held, out of respect for royal dignity. But word spread fast. The marriage had not been consummated, and wouldn't be, at least not for many nights after. Carlos, it was whispered, was either too weak, too afraid, or simply unable. Panic began to grow in political circles across Europe. With no heir in sight, speculation turned to succession. Spain's throne and its sprawling empire would soon be up for grabs. As weeks turned into months and then years, the pressure mounted. Doctors came from foreign lands, bringing new cures, herbs, and even alchemical elixirs. Some promised miracles. None delivered. They tried bloodbaths, from bulls, chickens, even exotic beasts. Magic talismans were smuggled into chambers. Exorcisms were conducted in secret. One ritual involved bathing the king's loins in the blood of a freshly killed goat. None of it worked. Carlos II's condition remained unchanged. His seed, if he had any, was incapable of bringing life. And as the years passed, even hope began to die. Modern science, centuries later, would find clarity where superstition had fumbled. Carlos likely suffered from multiple recessive genetic disorders, perhaps Klinefelter syndrome, perhaps a form of androgen insensitivity, conditions that explained his physical traits, his developmental delay, and, most damningly, his infertility. In 1689, after a decade of marriage without a child, Maria Luisa of Orléans died suddenly. She was just 26. Officially, it was a ruptured appendix. Some whispered she had simply lost the will to live. Carlos fell into a deep depression, but royal duty allowed no time for mourning. Within months, he was married again, this time to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess famed for coming from a fertile family. Her mother had birthed 23 children. Still, the union bore nothing. In the gardens of El Buen Retiro, the royal botanist José Quer y Martínez tended to medicinal plants in quiet reflection. He had long observed a strange phenomenon in his experiments. When the same plants were crossbred repeatedly, Their offspring grew weaker, more susceptible to disease. "It's as if nature resists inbreeding," he murmured to himself, unaware that his botanical observations mirrored the human tragedy unfolding inside the palace. Not far away, Carlos II sat alone on a stone bench, watching birds flutter in the sky. Despite his limitations, there were moments, brief flickers, when the king seemed aware of the grand irony of his life. A ruler who could not rule, a husband who could not father, a legacy he could not preserve. "Sometimes I dream of a son," he once confessed to his priest, "a healthy boy who might carry my name, but perhaps God does not wish it." His confessor offered no reply. How could he explain that it wasn't divine will, but human arrogance? Centuries of ignoring biology in favor of politics that had sealed Carlos's fate. By the late 1690s, the Spanish court had turned inward. Desperation loomed like a shadow over every decision. Doctors clung to rituals and superstition. Priests blamed demons. Nobles whispered of curses, but none could stop what was coming. On a cold November morning in the year 1700, the bells of Madrid tolled once again. Carlos II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, had died at the age of 39. His body, ravaged by decades of illness, was laid in the royal chapel. One of his physicians, Dr. Juan de Cabriada, watched the corpse in silence. He had seen the king suffer through seizures, infections, digestive failure, and, finally, renal collapse. A rare autopsy was ordered. What the doctors found was beyond anything they had expected. The body had no blood. The heart was the size of a peppercorn. The lungs were rotted. The intestines gangrenous. Only one testicle remained, blackened and shriveled, and the brain cavity was filled with fluid. To the medicine of that time, it was a mystery. To future generations, it was unmistakable. The end stage of dynastic self-destruction. The court gathered in the Alcazar to hear the reading of the king's final will. Tension filled the air as the notary broke the seal. The room held its breath as one name was announced: Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, a Bourbon. The French ambassador smirked. The Austrian one scowled. The war for Spain's throne had begun. But underneath the political maneuvering lay a deeper truth, unspoken but understood by all. The Spanish Habsburgs had come to their biological end. The purest blood in Europe had become its most fragile. The great dynasty had collapsed, not from war, not from revolution, but from within, from the quiet ticking of a genetic time bomb set generations ago. Today, Carlos II remains a symbol, not of power, but of consequence. His portraits hang in museums. His twisted jaw, vacant stare, and withered form are not just reminders of a tragic life, but of what happens when politics defy nature, when royal pride is placed above biology, and when a crown is passed from uncle to niece for too many generations. A dynasty once unmatched in glory, extinguished, not by blade or fire, but by its own blood. And in the silent shadows of the Escorial, where he is buried among kings, Carlos II lies beneath a simple epitaph, the last and most unfortunate of his line.